Hopefully everybody can see the presentation. Please do let me know, Neil, if that's not obvious or on the screen, but assuming that it is. So just okay. So is that okay? All right, lovely. Sorry. So, yeah, the BVRLA represents the demand side of the automotive industry. We represent members from leasing, rental, car club, subscription, and fleet management sector. Our members own and operate a combined fleet of 4 million cars, vans, and trucks. So that translates to 1 in 10 cars, 1 in 5 vans, and 1 in 5 trucks on the UK's roads that will be owned and or operated by a BVRLA member. Our members are responsible for 50% of all new vehicles that are registered in the UK per annum. And our plug-in pledge states that by 2025, our members will be responsible for 80% of battery electric vehicle registrations in the UK per year. We're already behind a number of the battery electric vehicles that are being registered in the UK per annum, and those numbers that Neil just mentioned in the introduction. And our members very much are committed and recognise the critical role that they have to play in accelerating the uptake of zero emission transport. So I want to share with you this morning some of the insights and recommendations from some research that we did earlier in the year. And the fleet charging guide that we produced. So the reason we pulled this together was it was quite clear to us when we started to engage with the EV Energy Task Force, and also in conversations we were having with the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, OZEV, that there was quite a significant knowledge gap when it came to private sector fleets, particularly that those that weren't based at depots. But we had already started to do some work around some of the challenges facing commercial vehicle fleets. And it was something that we wanted to build on. So this was very much done to support the OZEV's EV infrastructure strategy, also the EV Energy Task Force modelling that was being conducted, and also recognising that a lot more responsibility is being passed on to local authorities. And one of the challenges for fleets is that quite often, particularly with national fleets, they will be traveling across the country. So they may not necessarily live or work in some of those local authority areas, but they will be reliant on the infrastructure within those local authority areas. So recognizing the responsibilities of local authorities, we wanted to produce this guide to show the diversity of fleet. So looking at a range of different usage profiles, some of the challenges that fleets are then going to face when looking to use different types of charging. We were then able to start to allocate the type of charging that we think will be required for these various users. The report then also has a number of high-level policy recommendations, which I'll come on to towards the end of the presentation. And what I would say is, this is very much a start point. There was no way we could have covered every single type of fleet use case. So what we wanted to do was start to group some common use cases together to identify some of the usage requirements and use this as something that we can build on over time. So one of the key outputs that we produced as part of the report is this one-page visual. So this shows us some of the diverse use cases, so where we've grouped the different types of usage. It then shows some of the charging challenges that those different users will face. And then based on that usage, we've been able to allocate a preferred type of charging, but also show where other types of charging are likely to be required. And I can drill down into that a bit more now. So the first group is the vehicles that we've assigned to at-home or workplace charging being their preference. Now, for disabled users, it's quite obvious that because of their accessibility needs, they are going to have to charge, if not at home, then very, very close to their home. So that's why we've allocated the disabled users here. There's some fantastic work that's being undertaken by Motability with the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, which we're very supportive of, and look forward to seeing how that develops. And I know there is a standard that is out for consultation at the moment that starts to address some of the accessibility needs for disabled users. The other group that we've put here is the company car. So when we interviewed a number of fleets as part of this research, it was quite clear that it's very much the company car that is leading the transition for fleets. There are a few reasons behind that. We have seen some very preferential benefit in kind taxation rates, which have meant that perhaps people are now opting for an electric company car when they may not ordinarily have otherwise done so. But also, you know, when we look at the company car, I think in a lot of cases, they have opted for that because they can easily charge at home or at the workplace. When we look at commercial vehicles, the technology is lacking. It was very clear that, you know, company cars are quite a few years down the track now, and we've seen that with the uptake rates of electric vehicles in the car market. For vans, it is a little bit more problematic. It's only over the last sort of year or so that we started to see vans with better range, towing options and things like that. So it is still very much in its infancy, but it's definitely something that is moving very, very fast. And we were able to speak to a number of fleets that had started to put electric commercial vehicles onto their fleet. So we start with the vehicles that we've assigned to at depot. And we've got two different types of commercial vehicle users here. The first is delivery services, which is quite self-explanatory. This is people who are delivering goods and services to our homes, workplaces, etc. The other category then is quite a broad brush category. So we've called this engineer work van, and this includes people that are offering recovery services, utility providers, potentially sort of local tradespeople, site and construction workers, and then also the engineers that come into our homes, workplaces to install, repair, maintain our boilers, central heating, and other household goods. What's common with all of those users under the engineer work van is that quite often the vehicle's not just there to take the driver from point A to B, but it's also there to carry the tools that person is going to be required to do the job. So that's worth bearing in mind when we look at some of the challenges and some of their charging requirements. So when we look at depot, one of the key challenges that is being faced is the grid connections process, particularly where there's not enough capacity at that site. So where someone is looking to put the infrastructure in place, but there's not enough electricity being provided at that site. So this can then trigger what can be quite a costly process, but also extremely complex for fleets who perhaps have never had to engage with the energy industry before, but it can also take a significant amount of time. So some of our members have reported sort of, you know, a year, in some cases over 18 months to actually put that infrastructure in place once they've started the process. When we talk about the cost, we're talking about costs in the hundreds of thousands of pounds as well. So that can, in a lot of cases, be a major barrier when people are looking to put that infrastructure in place at depot. And whilst we welcome the consultation that Ofgem did last year and some of the changes that they were looking to introduce from next year, where they were looking to remove some of that reinforcement cost, we're not sure it goes far enough to support those that are looking to put this infrastructure in. We did have a couple of interesting observations when it came to people who were charging at depot. The first was because some of these vehicles do still have limited range, so they are still going to be requiring some form of top up during the working day, even if they are fully charged when they leave the depot. They will require some form of top-up charging, which would have to be rapid because it's going to need to be done in the working day when the driver's going to have limited downtime. So they'll be looking to take a quick top-up charge whilst completing paperwork, other tasks, or potentially when taking their lunch break. So because of that, and because of some of the complexity and some of the costs, definitely one of the fleets we spoke to who had quite aggressively started to roll out depot-based infrastructure had decided to take a bit of a pause, recognizing that, you know, public charging infrastructure is going to have to move at quite some pace to cater for growing user demand. They wondered whether perhaps that may be a more viable solution to them, particularly now as things like the ability to roam are going to be catered for. So in the announcement, when the government announced the EV infrastructure strategy, they also announced some of the areas they were looking to mandate as part of the consumer experience, one of which was around the ability to roam. So this means the driver wouldn't have to have a whole myriad of different apps and cards to be able to utilize public charging. What they really want is a fuel card equivalent, and something that gives them access to all of the different types of charge points via one card, which, you know, with the roaming solutions that are being addressed, hopefully will give that as an option. So it was quite an interesting observation to see that even where people had quite aggressively put that depot-based infrastructure in place, they were taking pause and looking at whether perhaps the public charging network could be a more viable solution. And that's definitely something that we want to build on and see how that progresses over time. One of the other things was the number of vans that were being taken home by the drivers. And because of the pandemic and the requirement for people to work from home, this had become more and more common. In a lot of cases, people were looking at this being a sort of trend that was set to continue, where they were moving away from more of the depot-based model. So that brings us on to the next group. So using the same use cases, but this is where we're looking at near home charging. So in the majority of cases where the vans are taken home, this is where they're not able to charge at home and will require some form of charge that's within a sort of 5 to 10 minute max, but around the 5-minute walk from the driver's home. There are a number of issues here, particularly when it comes to accessible charging. So where there is on-street charging, quite often the bays will be too short, the cables aren't long enough to cater for a larger van. It was also interesting that quite a few of the fleets that we've spoke to, the drivers they were looking to make the transition first were those in areas where there were things like the clean air zones, ultra low emission zones, zero emission zones. So they tend to be the more urban environments that are more congested, where parking can be a challenge at the best of times. So trying to then find accessible charging and parking is going to be a challenge. Security is also an issue that needs to be catered for with the commercial van fleet. So I mentioned that quite often the van is there to carry the tools for the job. It's not just a case of being able to remove some of those tools. Quite often the van is completely kitted out with these tools, so you can't just remove them overnight. So secure parking is going to be really important as well. And even where there are areas where these vans could park securely in perhaps a nearby car park, quite often there are accessibility issues there where there's a height restriction, which means they're unable to get into the car park. We also spoke to some fleets where they had potentially found spaces where they could park securely and charge overnight, so perhaps in a nearby retail park. But because they're having to drive in front facing because of the location of the charging port, they're then having to reverse. And because they have a blind spot, this can then pose a bit of a health and safety challenge. So again, that can limit their ability to park in some of these areas if it's deemed to be too much of a risk. I think the other thing to mention here when we talk about the ability of people to charge at home, normally when we talk about the general public and those that won't have access to charging at home, I think it's around a third of people that we're talking about. When it comes to the commercial van fleet, I think this is likely to be far higher. Centrica, British Gas have spoken at a number of open forums where they're talking about around 70% of their engineers that won't be able to charge at home because they don't have the driveway, or if they do, it's perhaps taken up by the other family vehicle or is too far away from the location of the house and therefore the electricity supply. So there are some real key challenges here that need to be overcome. There's some really good work that's being undertaken by the Association of Fleet Professionals, which very much complements this guide, where they've started to map out some of the data from some of the larger fleets of where the drivers are taking the vans home and don't have the ability to charge at home. So that's, and some data that can be utilised, particularly by local authorities when they are looking at where this charging needs to be put into place. But we need to overcome the issues with accessibility and security. And then the final user group that we looked at were those with limited downtime. So this is where we've got taxis, private hire, ride hailing, car clubs, and rental vehicles, where there's very high levels of utilization, very quick turnaround times. So when we look at the rental fleet, the average rental vehicle is turned around in less than an hour. In many cases, sometimes less than half an hour, particularly at airports, which are a challenge all on their own. Very problematic when we look at how we get rapid charging infrastructure at airports and things like that. So it's quite obvious that, these are the use cases that are going to be very, very reliant on rapid charging infrastructure, not just for them, but also for their customers. So if you're renting a car club or a rental vehicle and you're paying by the minute, hour, or the day, the customer's not going to want to spend hours sat there paying to effectively charge the vehicle as well. So it's going to be really important for their customers as well. And this is where we think destination charging has a role to play as well. So particularly if these vehicles are being taken for leisure purposes, then, we need to have some form of destination charging at popular tourist destinations, at campsites and things like that. A number of our rental members are also looking at putting the infrastructure in place at their depots to cater for that rapid turnaround. But again, that's when we start to come across the sort of grid capacity issues and concerns. So the report makes 12 recommendations across the following 4 areas. The first is matching types of provision to emerging gaps in infrastructure. So this is very much looking to national government to provide support and guidance to local authorities to ensure that infrastructure can be developed in line with all users' needs and a benefit to all use cases. One of the recommendations here looks at the role that the local authority could potentially play in terms of engaging with the distribution network operators, the DNOs. So if you did have a number of depots that were looking to put the infrastructure in place, or if you had a retail park where you've got a number of people looking to put infrastructure in, then could there be a role for the local authority to bring those interested parties together so that those costs could at least be mutualised, so it doesn't just fall to the one user that trips the grid over capacity? So we're quite interested in exploring that, and we started to do some work with the Green Finance Institute and are looking to do further work with them during the remainder of the year to look at whether there is something more that could be done in this area. One of the other things here is that we would like to see a regular review by government, both nationally and locally, where they look at whether private charge point operators are filling gaps in public charging provision. So, when we talk about the local authorities, I don't think it's a case that we're looking to the local authority to provide all of the charging, but at least for them to sort of coordinate and facilitate, identify any gaps in terms of the user demands and what's happening with both private and public charging infrastructure, and then looking to plug those gaps. The next area is around building trust in the reliability of infrastructure. So this is really looking at introducing and upholding standards so that local authorities, central government can take action where there are ongoing issues. So, for example, looking at local authorities to set enforceable service level agreements with charge point operators around reliability standards and things like that. Encouraging the installation of more than 1 or 2 charge points in busy locations. But this is also where data, the access to dynamic data. So we're aware that the government is looking at opening up data, but I think the more we are able to get, charge points that cater for disabled users and have that disabled accessibility requirement, but also hopefully when we start to see more van accessible charging as well, that must be one of the data sets that's opened up so that people can find those available charge points that are going to be accessible for their needs. The third area then is around ensuring consistent ease of access. A lot of this has been catered for in some of the areas that the government's looking to mandate. So, for example, looking at looking at where the government are looking to mandate for roaming to support the use of a fuel card equivalent, also looking at the reliability standards. And I guess the other area here really is looking at how you cater for the disabled users as well and things like that. So a lot of work's been done in this area, which is great to see. The final area then is really around the role that the local authority can play in terms of facilitating more effective engagement with all the relevant partners. So utilising skills, the knowledge, and as I mentioned, some of the data and the project that's being done by the Association of Fleet Professionals to ensure that infrastructure can meet all users' needs and cater for all of those different vehicle types and use cases. And just in closing, I think the comment I would make is, fleets are very much leading the transition to electric vehicles. It's really important. They have a really important role in terms of them feeding more affordable vehicles onto the second-hand market, and in really accelerating the uptake to electric. And they are the early adopters. So actually, if we can work with fleets and get the charging infrastructure right for fleets, then hopefully that's going to give us a very robust charging network that caters for all different users' needs and requirements and is future-proof for many years to come. So thanks very much, and happy to take any questions as part of the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Neil. I was going to say it's a real pleasure to be presenting some of the work that we at Zemo, along with partners in the EV Energy Task Force, have been conducting over. It's not just the last 2 years; it's more like 4 years actually. But yeah, it was the task force was actually launched by Theresa May back in 2018. But anyway, yeah. So this is I have to say, first of all, thank you very much to the BVRLA and Catherine Bowen, who have been a real stalwarts in supporting the work of the task force. And as Catherine said, sort of bringing to life some of the real issues that are facing fleets. And this is really important in the overall scheme of the work of the EV Energy Task Force. And I'm going to want to talk today about the work of with regard to EV fleet charging requirements and how it is evolving and some of the issues that it's facing as Catherine has highlighted, but also how it needs to evolve and the role it can play in delivering the transition to electrifying transport over the next decade and a half. Neil mentioned the Task Force Charging the Future Drivers for Success 2035 report, which we published at the end of March at our main conference. And that really set out the sweet spot for success in terms of moving to electrifying transport, and how we're able to comply with the ambition to end the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles, and comply with Carbon Budget 6. And the implications that has in terms of the number of vehicles that will need to be on the road, and in terms of the infrastructure that will need to be deployed, and the types of infrastructure, the challenges that will need to be faced. And the report identified 5 key enabling conditions. The public charging needs to be built ahead of need to gain confidence from users. The essential role that local authorities have to play in ensuring that we have the energy and transport planning is coordinated. The role that public charge points have in terms of creating this market, and the need for public charging and the deployment of public charging, and the need for that to be used and usable. The role that smart charging has to play wherever it's appropriate, if we need to manage or minimize the costs of reinforcing the network, and the role of informing and educating and protecting EV users, to as we develop that mass market. What I want to do is to sort of paint in the role that the EV fleets and the roles that fleets will play as a critical building block in supporting this transition, and how that fits into the overall objectives and recommendations that the task force has come up with. The task force, just very quickly, the steering group comprises a range of organisations, all of which are represent member organisations. But beyond that, we have over 350 separate organisations of input to the work of the task force over its life to date. But coming back to fleets, I mentioned the government's ambition, and we'll all have seen that decision from government to cease the sale of vehicles powered by internal combustion engines by 2035. We also have had in place for some time now a series of carbon budgets, and Carbon Budget 6 really is quite demanding, and will require the decarbonisation of transport to be taken seriously. And so is completely in line with the government's objectives of ending the sale of internal combustion engines and electrifying transport, along with the decarbonisation of the grid, will be critical in terms of meeting the 6th carbon budget. This is going to be challenging. In terms of our work with fleets, we identified that fleets have absolutely been at the forefront of adopting electric vehicles and helping to develop charging infrastructure. And there have been some ambitious targets that fleets have set for themselves in terms of adopting electric vehicles. However, even the most ambitious fleets are going to be challenged by what we're going to face, the transition that we're going to face between now and 2035. It's going to be challenging for fleets, it's going to be challenging for vehicle manufacturers, and it's going to be challenging for infrastructure providers. So one of the key things that we need to do is to coordinate the activity and the planning and the investment across a number of sectors. And I think Catherine's absolutely right to identify fleet as being a crucial role to play. And I think that's important to challenge the perspective, because when you talk about EVs, the perception is it's very much around cars and private consumers. And the role of company car fleets is perhaps less understood, and the importance of van fleets and the commercial fleet sector is going to be very important in these next steps. In terms of the challenge, we, along with the Energy Systems Catapult, conducted some very detailed modelling work, looking at what that transition to decarbonisation and meeting the sixth carbon budget would mean in terms of the vehicle park, in terms of the registrations, in terms of the charge point numbers out there and the mixes. And to put this into perspective, we're looking at moving to increase the number of electric vehicles, BEVs, registered each year by 13 times over the next decade, to build up a park by 2035, a park of 27 million BEVs by 2035. And that's the kind of order of magnitude that's required to meet Carbon Budget 6 and to successfully decarbonise transport. And that is a challenge. And based on some of the forecasts of public announcements on global production capacity for EVs, that would mean that some 7% of EVs will be coming to the UK by 2030. So I think that points to a challenge there for the vehicle manufacturers in bringing, advancing investment decisions and bringing new vehicles to market. It also places a challenge on the market to absorb those vehicles and attract those vehicles to the UK. And fleets will be playing an important role, as Catherine said, in terms of adopting those vehicles and then in terms of providing the demand for the charge points. But if we're going to do this, and fleets represent a large part of the market, we need to understand where fleets are at the moment and how things are going to change. To meet that ambition, huge growth in EVs. Fleets and business account for over 50% of new car registrations and a larger majority of the van market. So what we set out to do is to understand the current position for fleets, what vehicles they're using, the types of operations, where they're kept, how they're charged, what barriers they face. And the work of the BVRLA, along with additional work commissioned by ZEMO and the EV Energy Task Force, have helped shed light on that. One of the key things that has come out of that is understanding how the market has developed to date. And it's absolutely true that fleets have been at the forefront of developing the EV market and adopting these vehicles. And as Catherine said, the focal point has been on company cars predominantly, and then also on the depot-based fleets, whether that's car or van fleets, and then other types of operation really have been periphery to those. Although it's right to recognise the roles of taxi fleets, of on-demand fleets, on hire fleets. And in terms of where these vehicles are being kept, understandably, fleets are have been looking to place them to date in those locations it's easiest to invest in and it's easiest to control, and that's predominantly been off street. Looking to keep those vehicles off street and to charge those vehicles off street on private land. And that quite understandably makes it an easier business case to ensure that you've got the infrastructure to support the vehicles you're investing in and to ensure that you get a return on investment. That's not to say that there aren't barriers to that private charging model. And most of the challenges that we've identified to date have been around that cost and the process of connecting to the grid, as Catherine highlighted in more detail. And that process being slow and bureaucratic and difficult in terms of planning, in terms of planning permission, in terms of identifying where you can connect to the grid, in terms of identifying what the cost of connecting to the grid is, in terms of finding a suitable space to locate charging infrastructure, particularly at depots. But with all those constraints, important constraints, and action is being started to be taken on those, and we've been highlighting the action that needs to be taken. But against all those constraints, off-street charging for fleets offers a simpler business model to provide convenient and cheap charging for their vehicle fleets. In terms of the use of public charging, it's key things that have come up is that lack of public charging, and for a fleet, the charging points need to be in the right place so you can charge at the right time. And for a business user, that's got to be a requirement to fit into the scheduling of the operation of the fleet. And that's about the reliability and the availability. The drivers need to be able to charge quickly and conveniently. Physical and transactional interoperability. You need to be there needs to be no barriers to be able to use a charge point, whether it is the design of the charge station, or the ability to pay, and indeed the data coverage. And one of the issues that we've identified is the importance of a communication strategy more generally, to ensure that real-time information is available, and charge points are connected, and we're able to see which charge points are online and what they're available to be able to charge. And that point that Catherine so rightly highlights, the design of charge point stations, we need to make them accessible for larger vehicles, for specialized vehicles, for vehicles that are towing trailers, and vehicles that need to be able to drive through and not park nose onto the parking slot. So, what do we do with this information? Having understood the current situation, where do we need to go, and what is going to drive the infrastructure that we need? In terms, and we come back to one of those key enabling conditions. Public charge points have to be used and usable. That's so important, and it's so important for fleets as well as the wider community. And that is driven by where the vehicle is kept, the type of operation, the need, the ability to schedule charging into an operation cycle, that size of that vehicle, and the accessibility in terms of the charge point, in terms of the length of the cable, and in terms of ensuring that people with disabilities are able to utilize this. And Motability is a very large fleet operator. So all that features that need to be taken into account in terms of looking at the type of charging infrastructure that we need. We come back to the size of that challenge, and the need for public charging to be built ahead of need to gain confidence. Referring back now to the modelling work that was done by the task force, and we looked at charging in a number of locations, near to home, charging on private land, whether that's depots or home charging, public charging en route, and destination charging. In terms of the EV Energy Task Force, we looked at a range of different scenarios, which determines that how the market develops, and the business models behind different types of charging points. There is going to be a significant need for public charging. In particular, that we're going to need, the central case is we're going to need about 500,000 public charge points of various designs, whether it is slow on-street residential charging for van drivers who are taking the vehicles home with them but not got access to off-street parking, local rapid hubs, or local hubs where vehicles can be charged overnight on private land, en route rapid charging, and city centre charging. And also looking at the opportunity for private motorists to charge at work. But yes, a significant investment is going to be needed. And today we're roughly 30,000 public charge points, and we need to significantly increase that over the next decade. And the investment required for that is going to be of the order of £7 billion. And we've got a further webinar later this week, which is looking at the business models for different charge point networks and how to raise the investment in that. So how do we achieve the delivery of this? How do we make fleets able to take that lead, to bring vehicles into the market, to provide the base demand for charge points? And as in addition to the recommendations in the main report, our report that focuses on the needs of fleets identified a number of specific ones, some of them in common with what's been identified by the BVRLA, but some of those additional to those. The need for interoperable public charging, so that fleets can operate, can access as many, a wider range of charge point networks as possible. The need to have certainty of access, and that can be through real-time information to understand what charge points are available and whether they're accessible to the type of vehicle that you're driving, and potentially the ability to book that, or to have arrangements with fleet charge point operators to have commercial vehicle only charging or privileged access. But the importance of fleets is going to be very important, and that needs to be developed and brought into the business models of charge point operators. Forums to share information at the planning level, bringing fleets into the planning process at a regional or local level is going to be vitally important. We understand that local authorities have a very important role in terms of transport planning. The network operators have got a vital role in terms of the energy planning and reinforcing the grid. We need fleets to be part of that conversation to identify the locality that we need the charge points and the infrastructure to be reinforced to provide the service that's needed for fleets. But fleets can also collaborate, work together, set up local charging hubs, either through risk and cost sharing, or maximising charge points that have been put in place. We need guidance on the design of public charging bays. Catherine pointed to the excellent work that Motability are doing with BSI and with OZEV on specifications for design for the disabled. We need that more broadly for to ensure that we get the right types of charging points and station design to accommodate all the fleet's requirements. Something that hasn't been researched enough yet is how to better access the flexibility energy markets for fleets. And we think there's a real opportunity there in terms of providing electricity, both in terms of reducing the cost to fleet, but also providing a service back to the energy network. Also, as part of this, and I think government understand that providing greater certainty around policy grants, taxation is vital. We're starting to see that with the infrastructure strategy that's been published, and that needs to go further. But I think the final point I'd say and reiterate the point that Catherine made is that fleets are going to be a vital building block in establishing the transition to electrifying the transport market. Both in terms of adopting, purchasing and bringing those vehicles into the UK and putting them then onto the second-hand market. but also in terms of providing the base case demand on which investments for charging networks can be made, and it's vital that that planning is done in line with fleets. So that's my presentation. I'll now hand back to Neil and happy to take any questions as part of the Q&A.
I can see we've got one question already in the chat. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so please do enter any further questions into the chat. But perhaps I could just start with a sort of a general question to sort of summarize where we are, but it's probably initially for Catherine. But what do you see the key issues in terms of the growth in electrification of fleets? Is it? I mean, we hear a lot about the supply constraints in terms of vehicles. Do you see that as a bigger constraint now than infrastructure? And then when you turn to infrastructure, what do you see as the biggest challenges in terms of infrastructure, in terms of getting the electrification going in the fleet sector?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I can't lie. Supply is an issue. Is it a bigger issue than infrastructure? I'm not sure. It's a hard one to answer. I think when we talk about infrastructure, we're not just looking at the here and now. We're also planning for the future as well. So, you know, I mentioned at the start of my presentation, definitely for the commercial fleets, it's only really over the last couple of years that we have seen the vans with the longer ranges, with the towing options. So we've still got a way to go, but there's definitely a lot of demand there. And yeah, infrastructure needs to be able to cater for that demand and for people to be able to make that move. I think when it comes to smaller businesses in particular, it is a lot more challenging to make the business case stack up, particularly if you've then got to put in the infrastructure and you know, where you have got those connection costs and things like that. That is going to be a significant barrier that we do need to be able to overcome.
So in the near term, perhaps supply constraints, but you know, increasingly infrastructure is going to be the big issue. John, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
It always strikes me, you know, people talk about the chicken and the egg. Do we need the infrastructure first, and then the vehicles will come? You know, build it and they will come, or do we need the vehicles, and that will provide the case for the infrastructure? There isn't a chicken and egg situation. You know, you need, when the vehicle arrives, you need somewhere to charge it. They've got to come, they've got to come together. And I think this is one of the key things. We need to work across sectors to coordinate investment plans. You know, that's going to be important for businesses. You know, if you're a Royal Mail and you're talking about you know, thousands of vehicles, or whether you're a small SME with you know, a company car and a van, you need to know where they're going to charge that. You know, because you can't have vehicles with downtime. You need that certainty. So I think it's all about providing that funnel, if you like, of coordinating the planning and investment, so we, you know, when the vehicles arrive, and there is constraints in supply at the moment. The current global situation is not doing us any favors in terms of getting chips and the supply of vehicles. But you know, when those vehicles are flowing, we need the infrastructure to be ready and they're ready for them to charge. And it's going to be the right type of infrastructure. You know, we can't do this carte blanche and say, okay, let's put in 20 charge points here and they end up at the back of a car park or in some dead-end street. You need the right types of charging infrastructure in the right places, particularly for fleets to do their operations.
Okay, well, thanks, John. We've got a couple of questions from the audience. I'll start with the one that came in first. It's from Florentine Roy. And he says, as the DNO, how can we best make fleets aware of the innovative tools and connection offerings we are making available to them to cut down on costs and time to connect? And which one of you like to pick that one up first?
Should I start off? I've been, through the task force, we've been doing a lot of work with the Energy Networks Association and the DNOs, and I really think the DNOs have a really important role to play here. And it's not just with fleets, but it's with local authorities and ensuring that there's resources available and bringing some of these communities together. We talked about the importance of energy and transport planning and understanding where those fleets are going to be putting in charging infrastructure. And a lot of local authorities are struggling with resources and understanding how they're going to do this, and it must seem a mountain for them. And some of the largest fleets are really at the cutting edge and really understand what they're doing. But many, the fleet market's got a long tail to it, and there will be lots of people will be looking to follow on from the lead that other fleets are making. DNOs are regional regulated monopolies. They're big. They operate over a large area. They've got the potential to stand back and provide that coordination role. DNOs will be working with multiple numbers of local authorities, and they've got the opportunity there to sort of provide that overview, and also to provide a forum to which fleets can engage with local authorities and provide a consistency. We've had some initial attempts at how to engage. Ofgem with the ENA did some EV fleet forums. I think we've really got to sort of step that up, and we at ZEMO and BVRLA are members of ZEMO as well. I'm sure we're ready to stand up and sort of help talk about how we can get that access to local authorities, get that access to fleets, and to provide a consistent role. But I really think the DNOs have got a really important role, coordinating role that they can play.
Mm-hmm. So, Catherine, do you see a particular role for the BVRLA or for the fleet sector in helping to make fleets aware of some of those offerings from the DNOs?
Yes, definitely. And yeah, I agree with, what Jonathan was saying. And when I saw that question come in, I was really thinking about, unfortunately, I don't think there's as easy an answer to that question. I think it is about engagement at the various levels as well. And, not one thing's not going to work for all different fleets, because they do come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. And the way you're going to engage with a national fleet may be different to how you would engage with an SME fleet. So I think it is about engagement. It's about identifying bodies such as ourselves. Energy Saving Trust do quite a lot of work with fleets and things like that. So just making some of that known to some of the people who are having that direct engagement, as well as the local authorities, and just doing as much as we can to get that message out. And Jonathan mentioned there was some really good work that started. I mean, Jonathan and I were both part of a roundtable discussion with BEIS and OZEV, where we looked at producing a fleet charging, a guide around how to demystify some of the process. And that was put up, but I didn't really feel that it was sort of promoted beyond that. And it seems to have gone very quiet. So I think it's making sure that we do continue to have that engagement at local, regional, national levels, and just we're all working in the same direction and collaborating where we can.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Catherine. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but there is another question. I have one more that I'd like to finish with, but it's a question that often comes up, and it gets the goat of many electric vehicle drivers. But how are we going to prevent icing? That's people with ICE vehicles hogging and stopping legitimate charging use of bays and chargers. Any thoughts on that?
I think Coventry City Council have really laid down a really good case study on how to do this, and where they've developed and commissioned a charging network in and around the city. They've put in place a strategy to prevent icing happening and to control it. So their charge points that are being put in are able to monitor whether there's a vehicle in the charge point, at the charge point, and whether it's charging or not. And they link that back into their parking attendants. You need to have the right charge point, for the duration that you're allowed to park in a slot, because there are plenty of cases where there's a slow charging point at the parking slot you're only allowed to stay at for 20 minutes, which is absolutely no help to anybody really. But you know, having alignment in terms of the dwell time, the parking time, and monitoring that, and being able to feed that back through to an enforcement body is I think, you know, the approach that Coventry is taking is a really good example.
Catherine, I don't know if you had anything to add to that in terms of John's question.
Only that, you know, this is where I think, you know, we've got the reliability standards that are going to come into force, but I'm still not sure how we're going to enforce them. And again, if this is a responsibility that's going to fall on the local authority, it's just really important that there is some guidance and support from central government to the local authorities to make sure that, you know, things like the dwell times, how you cater for icing, best practice is shared, and that there's guidance that's going to enable the local authority to fulfill that role.
Okay, I'm conscious, guys, that we're running right to the end of time, but I've got one question. Perhaps it's just, you know, a takeaway for the audience and for others who might listen to this retrospectively on the recording. But if government's here, if government's listening to this, is there one or perhaps maximum two, you know, priority asks that, or things that need to happen in the short term to get the you know, to ensure that we don't hit a blockage in terms of fleet uptake of electric vehicles?
So for me, just to jump in, it would just be, please keep fleets in mind. You know, they are the early adopters. They have a variety of different use cases. If you can cater for their needs, it's going to set us up, you know, to make sure we've got robust charging infrastructure that suits everybody in the long run. You know, don't forget about the fleets and make sure you are engaging with them at all levels of the process.
I'd absolutely endorse that. And I think I'd add to that in saying that there's a lot of people thinking that we'll have obligations or duties or actions that need to be taken forward by local authorities. That's got to be backed up with resourcing. So, you know, along with the key role that fleets have got to play, local authorities have got to play an important role as well in coordinating this, and they going to need to be resourced to do it.
Right. Well, thanks, guys, and let's hope they're listening. I just want to mention a couple of events that are coming up that I think this audience may well be interested in. Tomorrow between 9 and 10, UKRI Innovate, UK KTN are holding a webinar, How Our Infrastructure Needs to Work with Green Vehicles. And we're back on Thursday, 10 to 11, the EV Energy Task Force, encouraging investments in the public charging infrastructure. So as John mentioned earlier, that's sort of looking at the business case on the other side of and very linked to some of the discussions we've been having here today. So that's really all from us, but thank you very much indeed for attending. Do share the recording when it's made available, and enjoy the rest of Green Infrastructure.